I noticed it before I fully understood it. Something about the front of my property felt exposed.
Wrong.
The morning light came in harsher than usual, cutting straight across the driveway instead of filtering softly through green. For a second, I thought it was just my eyes adjusting. Then I stepped outside and felt my stomach drop. My hedges were gone. Not trimmed. Not shaped.
Gone.
Reduced to jagged stumps like someone had taken a chainsaw and walked away mid-job. These weren't decorative bushes. I'd planted them years ago for privacy, a living wall between my land and the row of HOA homes uphill. They blocked noise. They blocked headlights. They blocked people who liked to stare. And now they were butchered. I stood there in silence, the way you do when your brain is trying to catch up with reality. The cut marks were fresh. Sap still glistened in the morning sun. Whoever did this hadn't even tried to make it neat. It was aggressive. Intentional. I checked my phone. No missed calls. No warnings. No notices taped to my gate. Then I saw the tracks. Deep tire marks leading back toward the HOA access road. Heavy equipment. The kind you don't bring unless you're confident you won't be stopped. That's when I noticed the view. From the hill above, the HOA homes now had a clean, unobstructed sightline straight into my property. My driveway. My yard. My porch. Everything I'd intentionally shielded was suddenly on display. And suddenly it clicked. This wasn't landscaping. This was entitlement. I walked the length of the hedge line, taking photos from every angle. Wide shots. Close-ups. The way the cuts crossed the property line by several feet. That detail mattered. Because those hedges weren't just plants, they were well inside my boundary. As I finished, a golf cart rolled up from the HOA side. Slow. Casual. Like this was a routine check. A man in an HOA polo stepped out, smiling like we were neighbors chatting over a fence.
Morning, he said.
Looks a lot more open now, huh? I stared at him. You cut my hedges. He nodded. They were obstructing the community view. We've had complaints. From who? I asked. He gestured vaguely uphill. Residents. The board approved removal. Removal, I repeated. Of my property. He shrugged. They were overgrown. They were planted, I said slowly, on private land. That's when the tone changed. He stopped smiling. The HOA maintains aesthetic standards. You maintain your side of the line, I replied. You crossed mine. He sighed, like I was being difficult. Look, if you want to file a complaint, you can. No. I cut in. You don't get to touch my land and tell me to file paperwork after. He pulled out his phone. I'll note your concerns.
Don't, I said.
Document what you did. That's when he said the sentence that sealed everything. It's just hedges, he said. Not a big deal. I watched him drive away, the golf cart disappearing back toward the houses that now had a perfect view of my yard. And in that moment, something settled in my chest. Not rage, not panic, but certainty. They didn't ask because they didn't think they had to. They didn't warn me because they didn't respect the boundary. And they thought I'd complain, maybe replant, maybe grumble and move on. They were wrong. If they wanted a view so badly, I was going to give them one. Just not the one they were expecting. I didn't confront the HOA again that day. I didn't send an angry email or march into their office. I did something much more effective. I measured. That afternoon, I pulled the original survey from my files and walked the property line with a tape, stakes, and spray paint. Every hedge stump they'd cut sat a full 6 to 9 feet inside my boundary. No easement. No shared line. No ambiguity. This wasn't a trimming mistake. It was a straight-up trespass. Then I called my attorney. He didn't even let me finish before he interrupted. They cut inside your line? Yes. How far? When I told him, he exhaled slowly. That's not an HOA issue anymore. That's property damage and trespass. By evening, I had a plan. The next morning, the HOA sent their follow-up email. It was smug in that polished, legal-light way HOAs love. They cited community aesthetic concerns, claimed the hedges posed a safety and visibility issue, and assured residents the action was within HOA authority. Authority they didn't have. They even attached before and after photos, taken from the HOA side, celebrating the improved view. Those photos became Exhibit A. I responded once. Brief.
Calm.
Professional. I attached the survey, highlighted the boundary, and asked one question. On what legal basis did the HOA authorize work on private land without notice or consent? They didn't answer. Instead, 3 days later, a violation notice appeared taped to my gate. Apparently, my remaining hedge debris was now considered unsightly and in violation of HOA standards. That's when I stopped being polite. My lawyer filed a formal demand letter, unauthorized entry, destruction of landscaping, and willful trespass. Replacement cost for mature hedges wasn't cheap, especially fast-growing privacy hedges that took years to establish. Add labor, loss of use, and privacy invasion, and the number climbed quickly. The HOA's response was creative. They claimed implied permission, that the hedges functioned as a shared visual barrier and therefore fell under community management. They even suggested that because residents had enjoyed unobstructed views in the past, my hedges were an unreasonable interference. My attorney laughed when he read that part. "There's no such thing as a legal right to stare into your neighbor's yard," he said. That afternoon, I walked the cleared line again. Without the hedges, the exposure was obvious. Upstairs windows now looked straight down onto my property. People lingered longer on balconies. Phones came out. I caught someone filming when they thought I wasn't looking. That's when the idea formed. If the HOA wanted openness, if they thought privacy was optional, then I'd remove all doubt about where my land ended and theirs began. I didn't want fences. Fences still feel negotiable to people like this. I wanted something unmistakable, something industrial, something that screamed private property without a single word. I made a few calls. Shipping containers aren't hard to find if you know where to look. Rusty ones? Even easier. The kind that look immovable, permanent, and aggressively unwelcoming. By the end of the week, I had permits pulled, delivery scheduled, and a placement plan that followed my property line perfectly. No encroachment, no violation, no gray area. The HOA had taken my hedges to improve their view. They had no idea what was about to replace them. And once it arrived, there would be no pretending this was about landscaping anymore. The first container arrived at 7:12 a.m. on a Tuesday. I know the exact time, because that's when my phone started blowing up. A low rumble rolled through the ground as the flatbed turned onto my driveway. The driver hopped out, checked the placement diagram I'd given him, and nodded. Minutes later, a rust-streaked steel container, 40 feet long, 8 feet wide, 8.5 feet tall, was lowered gently onto concrete footings I'd poured the week before. Perfectly inside my boundary. From the hill above, the reaction was immediate. Curtains twitched. Patio doors slid open. People stepped out onto balconies, coffee forgotten, staring down in disbelief. The view they just gained vanished behind a wall of weathered steel. And that was just the first one. By noon, 3 more containers arrived. Each one placed end-to-end along the exact line where my hedges had stood. Not crooked, not aggressive, just precise. Industrial. Final. The HOA president showed up before the 4th container was even off the truck.
He didn't bring a clipboard this time.
He brought urgency. "You can't do this," he said, breathless, gesturing wildly. "This is disruptive. It's unsightly." I smiled calmly.
Funny.
"That didn't stop you. This violates community standards. You don't have authority here," I replied, holding up the survey map. "Remember?" He tried a different angle. "Residents are furious. You're ruining property values." "You ruin my privacy," I said. "This is the replacement." He threatened fines. I reminded him, politely, that my property was not part of the HOA, and any attempt to levy fines would be harassment. He threatened to call the police. I handed him my attorney's card and suggested he do exactly that.
So he did.
2 officers arrived mid-afternoon. They parked, stepped out, and immediately looked confused, in the good way. No shouting. No confrontation. Just steel containers sitting squarely on private land. I walked them through everything. The survey, the hedge destruction photos, the demand letter, the permits for the containers. One officer walked the line with me, towing the boundary markers. He nodded slowly. "These are legal," he said to the HOA president. "And they're on his property." "But they're ugly," the president snapped. The officer shrugged. "Ugly isn't illegal." That phrase traveled fast. By evening, neighborhood social media pages were on fire. Photos of the containers flooded feeds. Captions ranged from "this is extreme" to "good for him." Someone posted the HOA's original, improved view photos side by side with the containers. The comments did not go the HOA's way. What they didn't realize yet was that the containers were just phase one. Inside each one, I'd planned something very specific. The next day, the HOA's lawyer sent a letter claiming the containers constituted a spite structure intended solely to harm neighboring property enjoyment. My lawyer replied with case law. A lot of it. Spite structures only apply when a structure serves no legitimate purpose. Mine were being converted into storage and workshops. Fully permitted. Fully functional. The rusted exterior? Cosmetic. And entirely my choice. By the end of the week, the HOA stopped sending letters. Not because they were satisfied, but because they'd finally realized something. They had no leverage left. They had crossed the line first. Literally. And every move they made after only proved intent. Standing in my yard that Friday evening, I looked at the containers catching the sunset, scarred, solid, unapologetic, and felt something close to peace. They wanted a view. What they got was a boundary they could never ignore again. The silence from the HOA didn't last. It never does. 3 days after the last container was placed, a certified letter showed up in my mailbox. Thick. Formal. The kind that tries to intimidate just by existing. Inside was a notice of community impact review, complete with accusations dressed up as concern, visual blight, noise potential, safety hazards, and my favorite, intentional obstruction of scenic corridors. Scenic corridors. I forwarded it to my attorney without comment. He called me back laughing. They're still pretending this is their land. That afternoon, the HOA held an emergency board meeting. I wasn't invited, but half the neighborhood seemed to be there. Someone streamed it. Word traveled fast. Residents complained loudly. Not about me, but about the board. Why did you cut his hedges in the first place? Did you even ask? Why are we paying legal fees for this? That last question hit hard. Because by then, the HOA's legal bill was already climbing. Fast. Meanwhile, the city inspector paid me a visit. Not because of a complaint, but because of the permits I'd pulled. He walked the container line, checked setbacks, reviewed footings, and signed off without issue. Honestly, he said, this is cleaner than half the fences I see. I thanked him and watched him drive off, knowing that moment mattered. Once inspections bless something, it becomes very difficult to undo. The HOA tried one last maneuver. They sent landscapers to repair the remaining hedge stumps on my land. I caught it immediately. I walked out, phone recording, and told them to leave. When they hesitated, I called the police. This time, the officers didn't even bother walking the line. They recognized the address. "This property again?" one of them muttered. The landscapers left. The HOA got another warning, this one documented. That was the breaking point. 2 board members resigned within a week. One cited personal stress. The other blamed unforeseen legal exposure. The president stopped answering emails entirely. Then came the mediation request.
Not a demand.
Not a threat. A request. We met in a neutral office downtown. The HOA's lawyer looked tired, worn down. He slid over a proposal, partial hedge replacement, monetary compensation, and a request, politely worded this time, that I remove some of the containers. I didn't even look at it. "You destroyed mature landscaping without permission," I said calmly. "You invaded privacy. You trespassed. And you did it for a view you had no right to." He nodded slowly. "What do you want?"
Control, I said.
"And distance." No more entry. No maintenance. No authority, implied or otherwise, over anything on my side of that line. Ever. And compensation sufficient to replant on my terms, not theirs. They asked about the containers. They stay, I said. Unless I decide otherwise. There was a long pause. Then a quiet sigh. Understood. The agreement took 2 weeks to finalize. The HOA paid. Not just for replacement hedges, but for years of lost privacy and documented trespass. They recorded a formal acknowledgement of boundary violation, and they amended their bylaws to explicitly exclude my property from any future aesthetic enforcement.
Publicly.
The day the check cleared, I stood between the containers and looked uphill. People still watch sometimes, but now it was different. No entitlement. No assumptions. Just acceptance. The HOA thought cutting my hedges would give them power. Instead, it exposed exactly how little they had. The funny thing about power is that it doesn't vanish when it's exposed. It just changes hands. After the agreement went public, the neighborhood felt different. Quieter. Not calmer exactly, more cautious. The HOA stopped sending letters. No more friendly reminders. No more clipboard patrols lingering near my boundary like they own the air. They didn't. The containers stayed right where they were, rust and all. I could have repainted them, dressed them up, made them pretty.
I chose not to.
They were doing their job perfectly, standing there like a reminder you could see from half the hill. This line matters. Over the next month, I replanted the hedges, but not the way they were before. Taller varieties. Denser. Planted deeper into my land, with irrigation the HOA would never touch. A living wall that would outlast every board member currently pretending to be in charge. Neighbors started stopping by. Quietly.
Carefully.
A couple apologized. One admitted he'd voted for the hedge cutting because he thought it was already approved. Another said the board told them I was uncooperative and difficult. I smiled and said nothing, because results speak louder than rumors. At the next HOA election, turnout was the highest in the community's history. The remaining board members were voted out almost unanimously. New faces. New tone. First order of business? An audit. Turns out the hedge incident wasn't an isolated event. They'd overstepped before, just not with someone who pushed back hard enough to make it hurt. Fines misapplied. Authorities stretched. Property lines treated like suggestions. The audit findings never made it to the website, but everyone knew. You could feel it in the way people talked now, less whispering, more certainty. As for me, I got one last letter from the HOA. Not certified. Not threatening. An apology. It acknowledged the mistake, the overreach, and the damage done. It promised a renewed commitment to respecting private property rights. I folded it once and put it in a drawer with the agreement. Not because I needed it, but because history has a way of repeating itself when people forget. Sometimes I catch someone staring at the containers from the hill. They don't complain anymore. They just look, then turn away. And that's the point. The HOA thought the view belonged to them. That because they'd been there longer, because they had meetings and titles and rules written by people who never owned an inch of my land, they could take what they wanted. They were wrong. Ownership isn't about paperwork alone. It's about boundaries and the willingness to defend them. Cut my hedges for a view? I blocked it with steel, patience, and the law. And every time the sun sets behind those containers, casting long shadows uphill, it tells the same quiet story. You don't get to erase someone else's rights just because you like the scenery better without them.